The land of Israel had forgotten the sound of rain. For 3 years, the sky remained sealed, as if heaven itself had turned its face away. The earth was cracked like broken pottery, and the air tasted of dust and judgment. The rivers that once ran through the valleys had become winding scars of stone. The farmers looked to the horizon every morning. But no clouds came, only the shimmer of heat, only the silence of God. The people murmured, "Has the Lord left us?" But the truth was harder still, it was they who had left him. In the days of Ahab, the land prospered in gold and grain. But the hearts of men grew hollow. Altars to Baal rose higher than the olive trees, and incense burned in the name of idols. Kings sought power, prophets sought favor, and truth was bought and sold like grain in the marketplace. The wind on Mount Carmel was sharp and dry, carrying the taste of dust and judgment. Before the crowd of Israel stood two altars, one built by man's pride, the other by God's promise. The prophets of Baal surrounded their altar first. They dressed in bright robes, painted their faces with ash, and danced like fire without flame. Their chants rose with the morning sun, wild and desperate. They cried, "Baal, hear us!" But the sky was deaf. They leapt, they cut their flesh, they shouted until the air itself grew weary. Blood darkened the stones, but no voice answered. Their God was a hollow echo, their worship a mirror turned toward emptiness. Elijah watched in silence. He said nothing, for silence speaks louder than mockery. He simply waited until the day leaned toward noon and the shadows shortened. Then he stepped forward. "Come near to me." His voice was not loud, but it carried authority that silence could not resist. The crowd hesitated, then drew closer. The prophets of Baal stepped back, their voices hoarse, their eyes dim. Elijah walked to the broken altar of the Lord. The stones lay scattered, covered in dust from years of neglect. He bent down and touched one. It was cold, heavy, and forgotten like faith itself. He began to rebuild. Each stone he lifted was a prayer, each placement an act of remembrance. 12 stones for 12 tribes, each one a testimony that the covenant still stood, even if the people had forgotten it. Children watched him from the crowd, wide-eyed and silent. They had never seen worship like this, quiet, deliberate, holy. When the altar was restored, Elijah placed wood upon it. Then the sacrifice, the lifeless bull that waited for life's flame. He looked at the sky, still cloudless, still unmoved. Then he did something no one expected. "Fill 4 jars with water," he said, "and pour it on the offering." The people murmured, confused. Water was precious. There was none to waste. But the servants obeyed. They poured until the wood was soaked. The stones glistened, and the trench below filled like a narrow river. "Do it again," Elijah said. They poured a second time. "Do it a third time." They poured again until everything was drenched and the crowd gasped. The prophet's hands trembled, not with fear, but with reverence. He stepped closer to the altar, bowed his head, and prayed. "Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Answer me, O Lord, so that these people may know that you alone are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then silence. No thunder, no lightning, only the wind stopped breathing. For a moment, all creation seemed to listen. And then it came, a sound deeper than the sea, a light brighter than 10,000 suns. The fire of God fell. It did not crawl from the edges of the sky, it descended in one heartbeat. White and pure, as though heaven itself had been torn open. The flames struck the altar. consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the water that dared to resist it. Even the dust beneath Elijah's feet turned to light. The crowd fell on their faces, crying, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Their voices broke the silence that had ruled the land for years. Elijah did not shout. He fell to his knees, eyes closed, and whispered, "This fire is not destruction. It is mercy." Because the fire of God never comes to destroy life, it comes to reveal it. It burns not to end, but to begin. It does not curse, it cleanses. The fire that day did not only consume the sacrifice. It consumed doubt. It consumed indifference. It consumed the illusion that God had left His people. And as the smoke rose, it carried with it years of sin, years of silence, and years of hearts turned away. The mountain glowed with light long after the flames had faded. People trembled, but within their trembling was something new: hope. For if God could still answer with fire, then perhaps He had never left at all. Elijah stood, his face streaked with ash and tears. The wind began to move again, soft and cool. It brushed his cloak, whispered through his hair, and carried a promise. Rain was coming. He turned toward the horizon and saw a glimmer over the sea. A single cloud small as a man's hand rose slowly into the sky. It was enough, because God never speaks in half promises. Even a whisper from Him carries the weight of eternity. Elijah lifted his eyes and breathed deeply. The drought had ended not because the people had earned it, but because God's mercy had endured longer than their rebellion. He fell to the ground, face to the dust, and prayed not for power, but for remembrance. "Lord," he said, "let this fire burn forever not upon the altar, but within the heart of your people." Then he closed his eyes. The mountain was quiet again, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence after a song, the stillness after revelation. And though no one could see it, the first drops of rain were already forming in the clouds above. And then silence. Heaven does not shout when it withdraws, it simply stops speaking. No dreams, no rain, no whispers in the wind. Yet somewhere, in the hill country of Gilead, a man still listened. His name was Elijah. He was not born to wealth nor trained in the schools of prophets. He was a man of solitude, of fierce devotion, and of unyielding prayer. While others built altars to foreign gods, Elijah built silence, a life stripped of noise, where only God's breath mattered. In the nights of drought, when even the stars seemed dim, he cried out, "O Lord, if they will not hear you in mercy, let them hear you in fire." It was not vengeance he sought, but awakening, for the people had mistaken abundance for blessing and silence for peace. They had forgotten that mercy unheeded becomes judgment postponed. Elijah's prayers were not eloquent, they were desperate. They rose from dry ground and cracked lips, carried on the same wind that scattered dust across the desert. And in the silence between one breath and the next, God answered not with words, but with purpose. "Elijah," said the voice within him, "stand before Ahab. Tell him that neither dew nor rain shall fall except at your word." So began the drought, not as punishment, but as invitation. God would speak again, not in the cool of the morning, but in the furnace of thirst. Years passed. The drought deepened. The people cried to Baal, to Asherah, to every god they could name, but the heavens gave no reply. Even the priest's blood, spilled in frenzy upon the stones, could not move the clouds. In the palace, Ahab grew restless, and Jezebel's eyes blazed with fury. Prophets of the Lord were hunted, their voices silenced in caves and tombs. Only one name remained like a wound on their lips: Elijah. He had vanished from sight, hidden by God near the brook Cherith, fed by ravens that brought bread and meat when the world had none. Later, he dwelled in Zarephath, in the house of a widow, where the oil never ran dry, and faith was kept alive by a whisper and a jar. 3 years passed in this quiet obedience. Elijah waited not for escape, but for timing. Faith is not proven by fire alone, but by waiting in silence until God says, "Now." And then, one dawn, as light crept across the barren hills, the word came, "Go. Show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth." Rain, a word almost forgotten, a promise almost impossible. But Elijah rose, wrapped his cloak around his shoulders, and set his face toward Mount Carmel. His steps were slow, but his heart burned. The fire had not yet fallen, but it was already alive within him. Along the road, he passed empty wells and wilted fig trees. Children with hollow eyes watched from doorways as he walked by, their mothers too weary to hope. Every step felt like prayer, every breath like remembrance. He carried no sword, no army, only faith. And in the distance, Mount Carmel stood like a dark sentinel against the sun, its ridges cutting the horizon like the edge of eternity. At the mountain's base, the priests of Baal had already gathered. Their chants echoed like thunder without rain. The air trembled with the noise of false worship, the sound of men trying to summon gods that do not speak. Elijah paused and looked upward. The wind shifted. He felt it, the stirring of something ancient and holy. It was not yet fire, but it was coming. He whispered, "Lord, I am here." And the mountain seemed to listen. The fire had vanished, but its light lingered on every face. Smoke curled upward like a prayer the wind refused to scatter. People stood motionless, eyes fixed on the altar that was now only ash and stone. Elijah remained on his knees. He did not lift his head to claim victory. He was not a conqueror, he was a witness. He knew that the true battle was not against false prophets, but against the silence that had grown inside human hearts. He rose slowly, his cloak heavy with dust and heat. The air smelled of iron and rain. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled not in anger, but in relief. Elijah turned to Ahab, whose face was pale beneath the crown. "Go up," he said, "eat and drink, for there is the sound of an abundance of rain." The king stared at him, stunned. There was no cloud in the sky, only the fading smoke of divine fire. But Elijah spoke with the calm certainty of one who had already heard what others could not. Ahab mounted his chariot and rode toward the sea. Elijah walked alone up the slope of Carmel. He climbed until the voices below were swallowed by distance, until only the sound of wind and his own heartbeat remained. At the summit, he knelt. The stones were still warm from the fire. He bowed his head between his knees and whispered, "Lord, send the rain." He sent his servant to the edge of the cliff. "Look toward the sea." The servant looked, then shook his head. "There is nothing." Elijah said, "Go again." The servant went, and returned 6 times with the same answer. Nothing. Each time, Elijah did not move. He remained bowed, silent, praying. He was listening for something deeper than thunder. He was waiting for mercy. On the 7th time, the servant ran back, breathless. "I see a cloud rising from the sea, small as a man's hand." Elijah lifted his head. The corners of his mouth trembled not with surprise, but with worship. He whispered, "That is enough." The wind shifted. The scent of rain spread like incense across the mountain. The first drop fell upon the back of his hand, cool, heavy, and holy. Then came another, and another. until the sky broke open with sound. The mountain that had burned now wept. Rain poured in torrents, washing the ashes from the stones, filling the trenches that once held sacrifice. The people below shouted and danced, lifting their hands to the sky. Their cries mingled with the roar of the storm, not fear now, but joy. Elijah stood in the downpour, his hair plastered to his brow, his cloak clinging to his shoulders. He lifted his face to heaven and closed his eyes. The fire and the rain both belong to the same God, one cleansed by flame, the other restored by water. Both were mercy, written in different tongues. He thought of the years of silence, the hunger, the thirst, the endless waiting. All of it had led here to this moment of fullness. The rain blurred the horizon until the sea and sky became one. Lightning flickered faintly in the distance, like the echo of a promise kept. Elijah whispered, "Lord, you have turned their hearts back again." He felt no triumph, only peace. Because true victory is not the fall of idols, but the return of faith. As the storm raged, he began to descend the mountain. The mud pulled at his feet. The wind tore at his cloak. Yet he smiled. Below, Ahab's chariot wheels spun in the rising water. Elijah felt strength surge through him, the same strength that had sustained him through years of drought. He gathered his cloak around his waist and began to run. Rain lashed his face, but he ran faster, his feet striking the earth like thunder. The hand of the Lord was upon him, and he outran the chariot all the way to Jezreel. The road shone like a river beneath the storm. Each step was a testimony. The God who sent fire now sent life. When Elijah reached the gates, the sky was still rumbling, but his heart was still. He looked once more toward the west, where the fire had fallen and the rain had begun. The same mountain stood in both memories, one of flame, one of mercy. He whispered softly, "The Lord lives, His word endures." Then he disappeared into the rain, a prophet walking between two covenants, the old of judgment, the new of grace. The storm rolled on. Its sound was not fury, but forgiveness. And over the land that had once been silent, the voice of God was heard again, not in fire this time, but in rain that sang upon the earth. The rain had fallen, but peace did not stay. The land was cleansed, yet fear still moved in the shadows of Jezreel. Elijah stood beneath a darkened sky, his cloak heavy with rain and ash. He had seen fire descend from heaven. He had felt the breath of God in the storm. But the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. From the palace came whispers. Jezebel's anger burned brighter than the fire on Carmel. Her messengers carried one sentence through the night: "By this time tomorrow, you shall be as one of them." Elijah fled. He ran not from death, but from despair. For the heart can face swords, but not the weight of hopelessness. He left the city behind and entered the wilderness. His feet pressed into the sand, leaving no trace. The wind erased every sign of him. He walked until the night swallowed the horizon, until his strength was gone. Under a solitary broom tree, he fell to the ground and whispered, "It is enough. Take my life, O Lord, for I am no better than my fathers." The desert did not answer. Only the wind moved, carrying his words into the emptiness. He closed his eyes, and sleep came like mercy. When he awoke, there was bread on the stone beside him, and water glistening in a jar that had not been there before. A voice, soft and near, said, "Arise and eat." He ate, drank, and lay down again. A second time, the voice came, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." He rose, trembling. The bread was simple, the water plain, yet it gave him the strength of purpose. He walked 40 days and 40 nights through barren land. The sun burned his back by day, and the stars watched in silence by night. He spoke little, for prayer had become breath, and silence had become his teacher. Sometimes he thought of the mountain where God had spoken to Moses. He wondered if the same voice still waited there or if the silence would remain forever. His mind was weary, yet his spirit refused to die. Faith is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to keep walking through it. At last he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. It rose from the desert like an ancient crown, its cliffs carved by centuries of wind and waiting. He found a cave and entered its shadow. The air inside was cool, quiet, heavy with memory. He sat upon the stone floor, his face hidden in his cloak. The voice came not as fire, not as thunder, but as a question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered with a broken heart. "I have been very jealous for the Lord. For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and slain your prophets with the sword. I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Then the voice said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." He rose slowly and stepped toward the mouth of the cave. The air trembled. A wind tore across the cliffs, so fierce that the rocks split and fell. But the Lord was not in the wind. Then the earth shook beneath him. The stones groaned, the mountain quaked. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the shaking came fire, a burning light that filled the horizon, flames dancing across the ridge where he had once seen judgment fall. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there came a sound so small it could be mistaken for silence. A still small voice. Elijah covered his face with his cloak and wept, for in that whisper was the God he had known in solitude. The same God who had fed him by the brook, who had heard his prayer on Carmel, and who now spoke in gentleness rather than power. The voice did not accuse. It healed. It did not command. It comforted. "Elijah," it said again, "what are you doing here?" And Elijah answered not with fear, but with surrender. "Lord, I am listening." The desert wind softened. The mountain grew still, and the silence, once a burden, became a presence. The whisper lingered in the air like breath upon glass. It was not loud, yet it carried the weight of eternity. Elijah remained bowed, afraid to move, afraid that the silence might end. Then the voice spoke again, calm and steady. "Return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Anoint Jehu to be king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, to be prophet in your place." Elijah lifted his head slowly. His tears had dried, leaving lines of dust upon his face. He did not understand why the Lord would still use him. He had run, he had doubted, he had begged to die. Yet God had not replaced him. He had restored him. The voice continued, softer now. "Yet I have left 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." The words fell like rain upon scorched ground. 7,000. He was not alone. He had never been. The cave was still, but the air inside felt new, as though the very walls had exhaled. Light crept through the entrance, touching the stone where Elijah knelt. He rose, his body trembling from hunger, but his heart steady. The fear that once crushed him had lost its voice. The silence that had tormented him had become sacred. He stepped out into the open desert. The wind was gentle now, its whisper no longer an echo of despair, but of guidance. Each grain of sand glowed in the morning light. The world looked the same. But everything had changed. The Lord had spoken again. And in that whisper was both command and comfort. You are not finished. Elijah began to walk. His steps were slow at first. But with every mile, strength returned. He no longer searched the sky for fire. He no longer demanded thunder. The voice was enough. Faith had become listening. And listening had become life. Days passed as he traveled through the wilderness. He saw ruins of old altars, their stones blackened by forgotten fires. He passed fig trees sprouting from dry soil, a sign that mercy was returning to the land. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, he saw smoke rising in the distance. Not the smoke of judgment, but of cooking fires, the warmth of life continuing. He approached a field where a young man plowed with 12 oxen. The man's name was Elisha. The plow cut through the soil with strength and rhythm. His hands firm, his eyes bright with purpose. Elijah watched for a moment, seeing in him what he himself had once been, a soul unafraid to labor, a heart unbroken by the world. Without a word, Elijah walked to him, took the mantle from his shoulders, and cast it upon the young man's back. The cloth fluttered once in the wind and settled. Elisha stopped. He turned, eyes wide, as though time itself had paused. The field was silent. The oxen breathed heavily. Elisha dropped his tools and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you." Elijah nodded. "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" Elisha returned only long enough to break the yoke of his oxen, to boil their flesh upon the wood of his plow, and to feed the people. Then he rose and followed Elijah, and became his servant. The mantle had found its future. The whisper had found its echo. Elijah looked at the horizon and smiled faintly. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be kings to confront, wars to warn of, and the shadow of death yet to face. But he was not the same man who had fled from Jezreel. He had walked through fire. He had endured the silence. And now he carried the voice of God within him. As night fell, stars appeared one by one above the desert. Elijah sat by a small fire, its light flickering against his face. He listened to the wind whisper through the stones. It was not empty now. It was filled with promise. He whispered, "Speak, Lord, and I will listen." The flame before him swayed gently, and the night answered with peace. The days that followed were quiet, yet filled with unseen purpose. Elijah and Elisha walked together through valleys and villages, their shadows stretching long upon the ground. Elijah seldom spoke. His eyes carried both memory and prophecy. He would often stop along the road, listening to sounds that only he could hear. The hum of wind through the hills, the faint echo of heaven's whisper still dwelling in his soul. Elisha followed faithfully. He watched the older prophet with reverence, not for the miracles, but for the silence between them. There were times Elijah paused, placing his hand upon a tree, as if feeling the heartbeat of the earth. "Listen, my son," he would say. God speaks not only through thunder and flame. He speaks through stillness, and in stillness, he renews the world. At night, they camped beneath wide skies. The stars were endless, and their light seemed to write words no human tongue could utter. Elijah often prayed softly, his lips barely moving. Elisha would listen, and though he could not hear the words, he could feel their weight. When dawn came, the two rose and walked again. In the distance, kingdoms shifted, kings fell, and armies gathered. But the prophets moved unseen, guided not by news or fear, but by a whisper remembered. One morning, They reached a small town where widows wept, where famine still lingered after years of drought. Elijah knelt beside a child who lay weak upon a mat. He touched the boy's forehead and prayed, not in command, but in quiet surrender. Lord, speak life again. The child stirred. His chest rose, shallow but steady. A mother's cry filled the air, not a cry of grief, but of awe. Elijah said nothing. He simply smiled and turned away. Elisha looked at him with wonder. You said the Lord is not in the fire, he whispered. But surely he is in this. Elijah nodded. Yes, he said softly. He is in the breath that returns. For days, they walked among the people, teaching not with words, but with presence. When others asked who they were, Elijah would say only, we are listeners of the voice. Years passed in this quiet labor. The prophet who once called fire from heaven, now called hearts back to stillness. He no longer feared kings. He no longer feared silence. The voice had become his companion. One evening, while the two rested near the Jordan, Elijah looked toward the horizon, where the sun sank into the water like a burning coin. He spoke softly. There will come a day when this mantle shall no longer rest upon me. When that day comes, do not weep. The Spirit does not die. It moves. Elisha bowed his head, saying nothing. But in his heart, he felt the first stirring of destiny. As the light faded, a cool wind rose from the east. Elijah stood, his cloak lifting gently behind him. He gazed toward the desert once more, toward Horeb, toward memory. He whispered to the wind. The voice still speaks. The stars answered with silence. But it was the silence of peace. He turned to Elisha and said, tomorrow, we cross the Jordan. Elisha nodded, unaware that the crossing would be their last together. The night deepened. The fire burned low. Elijah closed his eyes, and in the quiet rhythm of the river nearby, he heard again that same whisper, the one that had saved him in the cave, the one that would soon call him home. It said, your journey is not ending, Elijah. It is becoming light. He breathed deeply and smiled. For the first time, the prophet rested without burden. The voice had not come to command him, nor to send him. It had come to bring him peace. The sun rose softly over the Jordan Valley. The air was cool and still, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Elijah and Elisha walked side by side, their cloaks brushing against the reeds. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them carried the weight of farewell. Elijah's hair had grown white with years of wandering. The desert wind had carved lines upon his face, yet his eyes remained bright, clearer now than when he had called down fire from the sky. Elisha followed closely, his steps steady, but his heart heavy. He had known this moment would come, though he had never wished for it. They came to Gilgal, a place of beginnings and endings. Elijah stopped and said, stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Bethel. But Elisha answered, as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel together. Along the road, the sons of the prophets came out to meet them. They said to Elisha, do you know that the Lord will take your master from you today? Elisha bowed his head. Yes, I know. Keep silent. The journey continued. At each town, Elijah gave the same command, and Elisha gave the same answer. From Bethel to Jericho, from Jericho to the Jordan, the road became narrower, the air thicker with destiny. When they reached the Jordan, Elijah removed his cloak. He folded it, struck the water, and the river parted from side to side. The two men walked across on dry ground. Behind them, the water closed again like a curtain. On the other side, Elijah stopped. He looked at his young companion and said, "Ask what I shall do for you, before I am taken away from you." Elisha's voice trembled. "Let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." Elijah smiled faintly. "You have asked a hard thing. Yet, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so unto you. If not, it shall not be so." The two continued walking. The light around them began to change. The air shimmered as though heaven itself leaned closer. They spoke no more. Words were too small for what was coming. Then suddenly, a sound like the rushing of wind filled the sky. The heavens opened, and a chariot of fire appeared, drawn by horses blazing with light. Elijah's cloak lifted in the storm of glory. Elisha fell back, covering his face from the brilliance. "Elijah, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." The fire swirled around them. In one breath, Elijah was lifted upward. The light swallowed him, and his form vanished into the golden clouds. Only the echo of wind remained. Elisha fell to his knees. Before him, the cloak lay upon the ground. The same cloak that had once struck the waters. The same mantle that had rested upon his shoulders years before. He reached out, trembling, and took it in both hands. The fabric was warm, as though the fire had not yet left it. He pressed it to his heart and wept. But the weeping did not last long. He rose, stood upon the same bank where the river still flowed, and held the cloak high. "Where is the Lord God of Elijah?" he cried. He struck the waters, and the Jordan parted again. The river obeyed not the man, but the spirit that now dwelt within him. The mantle of fire had become the mantle of faith. Elisha crossed over, not as a servant following a master, but as a prophet walking in the same voice. The legacy of heaven had begun. The water rippled and closed behind him. Elisha stood alone on the far side of the Jordan. The air was still, and the scent of smoke lingered faintly in the wind. He looked up to the sky, but the fire had faded. Only the wide blue remained, empty, yet full of presence. He whispered, "My father, my teacher, the Lord still lives." The sons of the prophets who watched from afar saw him strike the water and cross over. They fell silent. Then one of them said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." They came to meet him, bowed low, and offered to search for their master. "Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has carried him to some mountain or valley." But Elisha shook his head. "Do not send them. He is gone." Still, they pleaded until he relented. They searched 3 days and found nothing. When they returned, Elisha said gently, "Did I not tell you not to go?" He turned away and walked toward Jericho. The people of the city came to him, their faces weary from drought and sickness. They said, "The water of this land is bad, and the ground brings forth nothing." Elisha looked toward the barren fields. He could almost hear Elijah's voice in the wind, telling him, "Listen to the silence. There you will hear what must be done." He called for a new bowl and filled it with salt. He walked to the spring of the city, lifted the bowl, and poured the salt into the water. "Thus says the Lord," he spoke softly, "I have healed this water. There shall be no more death or barrenness from it." The spring glimmered under the sun. The people waited, uncertain. Days later, their crops began to grow again. Children laughed by the riverbank. The water, once bitter, now sparkled clear. It was not magic, it was mercy, and the mercy came through obedience. The news spread through the land. The God of Elijah still lives. Elisha traveled from town to town, teaching, healing, and reminding the people that faith did not die with a prophet. He was younger, quieter, but there was the same light in his eyes, the same peace that had once rested on Elijah's face. At night, he would look up at the stars and remember that day at the Jordan. He still felt the warmth of the cloak in his hands. Sometimes he would dream of the chariot of fire and wake with tears upon his face, not of sorrow, but of longing for the same nearness to God. One evening, as he walked through the hills near Shunem, a widow saw him and called out, "Man of God, please stay and rest." She prepared a small room for him, with a bed, a table, and a lamp. It was a simple kindness, but in that room, the Spirit rested. From that place, Elisha's ministry grew, and miracles began to fill the land, not with fire and judgment, but with healing and restoration. He did not wear Elijah's voice like thunder. He carried it as a whisper of hope. Through him, the power of God became the comfort of men. Through him, the legacy of heaven touched the dust of earth again. And through him, the promise made in the wilderness was fulfilled, that the voice would never be silenced, but would pass from heart to heart, from fire to whisper, from prophet to prophet, until all the world would know, God still walks with man. The years that followed were filled with quiet wonders. Elisha moved through the land like a soft wind, not seeking greatness, but leaving renewal wherever he went. In every village he entered, people whispered his name with reverence. But those who had known Elijah saw something deeper. They saw the same stillness in his eyes, the same strength in his silence. One day, the widow of Shunem's son fell ill and died. Her cries echoed through the hills. When Elisha arrived, her eyes were swollen with grief. "Did I ask my Lord for a son?" she said. "Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" Elisha went up to the room where the child lay. The air was heavy, the silence unbearable. He knelt beside the bed and prayed. Then he stretched himself upon the child, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands, and breathed. The boy's body grew warm. Once, twice. Then the child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha smiled through tears. He called to the mother and said, "Take up your son." She fell to her knees in gratitude, not to him, but to the God who still remembered mercy. From that day, the people knew that the spirit of Elijah had not departed from the earth. Elisha's name became a symbol of hope, but he carried it with humility. He never sought the crowd, nor built altars in his honor. He knew the fire was not his. It was only lent, as it had been lent to his master. He walked often to the Jordan, the same place where Elijah had risen into light. There, he would sit by the water's edge, listening to the gentle rush of the river. Sometimes the wind would shift, and for a moment, he thought he could hear wheels of flame turning in the distance, a memory of that day when heaven touched the earth. He would whisper, "My Father, my teacher, the chariot of Israel still rides," and peace would settle upon him like dew. Years passed, and Elisha grew old. His beard turned silver, and his hands, once strong, trembled when he prayed. But the fire never left his spirit. One night, as he lay beneath the stars, he felt the nearness of that same voice that had called his master long ago. It said, "You have carried the mantle well. You have walked with mercy, not pride. You have kept the fire burning quietly in men's hearts." Elisha smiled faintly. "Lord," he whispered, "it was never my fire. It was yours." The voice answered gently, "And now it shall rest in those who believe." When dawn came, the sky over the Jordan glowed once more with golden light. It was not the light of fire, but of remembrance. The prophets of the land gathered by the river. They spoke of Elijah, They spoke of Elisha, and they spoke of the God who had walked among them through both. Generations later, when people told the stories of heaven's flame, they did not speak of thunder or spectacle. They spoke of obedience, and of love that listened. The chariot of fire had risen to the heavens, but the true inheritance remained on earth. The still small voice that continues to call, "Be still, and know that I am God." And so the mantle passed again, beyond names, beyond time, to all who would walk in the same whisper, and carry the same flame within their hearts. The legacy of Elijah did not end in the sky. It lives in the silence that listens for God. The dawn broke softly over the hills of Jordan. The light touched the earth like a promise. Elisha sat upon a stone ridge, his cloak wrapped around him, his eyes lifted toward the horizon. The world was quiet, no thunder, no fire, no whirlwind, only the whisper of morning wind moving through the reeds. And yet he felt the same fire, the same power that once split mountains, now dwelling quietly inside his chest. He had long understood the truth. God's greatest miracles do not always blaze across the sky. Sometimes, they breathe through the soul. He remembered the chariot of fire, the burning wind, the cry of farewell. But now, he no longer longed for such power. He longed for presence. He closed his eyes and prayed, "Lord, not my will, but yours. Let your fire live not above me, but within me." A warmth spread through him, not of flame, but of peace. It burned without consuming, shining without blinding. It was gentleness in strength, and strength in gentleness. As he prayed, a shepherd passed below with his flock. The man looked up and paused. Elisha seemed to glow in the light of dawn. The shepherd whispered, "Truly, the Lord is near him." But Elisha heard nothing. He was far beyond the noise of the world. In his stillness, he was closer to heaven than ever before. That day, he rose and walked toward the villages again. Wherever he went, people came to him, not seeking signs, but seeking peace. One man asked, "Prophet, where is the God who parted the Jordan?" Elisha smiled gently. "He is here," he said, and placed his hand upon his heart. "The fire you seek above is already burning within." The man lowered his head and wept. He had expected power. He found tenderness. And from that moment, Elisha began teaching not with thunder, but with silence. He would sit beside the weary, listen to their grief, and remind them that the Holy One still walks quietly among them. The more he taught, the less he spoke, and the less he spoke, the more the people heard. He no longer feared the days without visions. He no longer sought the sound of rushing wind. He had discovered a deeper revelation, that the voice which once called from the mountain, now whispered through the heart. One night, as the stars appeared like scattered embers, Elisha sat by a small fire and whispered, "My Lord, you have turned your flame into faith." The wind stirred the fire, and the flame bowed low, as if in answer. He looked to the heavens. He could almost see Elijah again, not in the chariot, not in the sky, but in the calm light of the stars. It was as though heaven itself was no longer above him, but within him. And in that moment, Elisha knew the truth that every prophet must learn, that the greatest miracle is not when God moves the world, but when he moves the heart. He whispered, "The fire still burns," and the night, silent and wide, seemed to listen. The next morning, the light broke over the Jordan like gold poured upon the water. Villagers were already awake, their songs faintly rising through the valley. Elisha walked among them. He carried no staff, no symbol of power, only his mantle folded neatly across his arm. Children followed him at a distance, whispering. They had heard the stories of rivers parting, of oil that never ran dry, of fire that fell from heaven. But the man before them seemed gentle, more like a shepherd than a prophet. An old woman hobbled toward him, her hands trembling as she spoke. "My son is gone to war," she said. "My heart cannot rest." Elisha placed his hands over hers. "Peace be upon you," he said softly. "The Lord sees your tears before they fall." She began to weep, and he stayed with her until the weeping turned to quiet breathing. No thunder followed, no light split the clouds. But something invisible changed. A burden lifted, a soul was healed. That day, word spread again. The prophet walks, and the weary find rest. Elisha's path wound through fields of grain and stone villages. Everywhere he went, life began to return. Not because of miracles, but because of mercy. He taught the farmers to pray before planting. He reminded the widows that God still provided in silence. He blessed the children with hands scarred from labor, not from war. Each gesture was small, but each spark lit another. By nightfall, as the people sat outside their homes sharing bread, they spoke not of signs, but of peace. And in that peace, the fire spread. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Elisha stood upon a hill overlooking the Jordan. A group of young prophets gathered around him, their faces earnest, their hearts burning to serve. One asked, "Master, how shall we keep the fire burning?" Elisha looked at the river below, its surface glowing like molten glass. He said, "The fire is not kept by hands. It is kept by hearts that refuse to grow cold." He pointed to the horizon. When we love mercy more than power, when we choose patience over pride, the flame will not die. Another disciple spoke, "But Master, what if the world forgets?" Elisha smiled faintly. "Then one man will remember. And that one man will be enough for God to begin again." The young men bowed their heads. In the fading light, they seemed surrounded by an unseen glow, as though the very air recognized the spirit that moved among them. Later that night, Elisha walked alone. He heard the gentle hum of crickets, the distant call of shepherds. He felt no fear of age or time. He whispered, "Lord, your fire burns quietly, yet it never fades." He remembered Elijah's voice, the whirlwind, the flame, and realized that those things had never truly left. They had simply changed form. Now, the fire was love. Now, the fire was peace. And Elisha knew, when the outer flame fades, the inner one begins. He raised his eyes to heaven. No chariot descended, no angel appeared, only the stars, burning silently, each one a reflection of the same divine fire. He smiled, and his words drifted into the night. The world still shines because God still burns within us. Years passed like the slow drift of clouds. The once young prophet had become an old man. His hair had turned silver, and his steps were no longer strong. But his eyes still burned with the same quiet light. He lived now on the edge of the valley, where olive trees bent gently in the wind. Each morning, he rose before the sun, and sat in the stillness, listening. The birds began their songs. The river whispered below, and in every sound, he heard the same voice that had once spoken on the mountain. It was no longer a whisper from beyond. It was the sound of God dwelling within. People still came to him, not for signs, but for peace. Farmers brought their troubles. Mothers came with their children. Soldiers came with their guilt. Elisha listened to each in silence, then spoke few words, words shaped not by knowledge, but by prayer. Be still, he would say. The fire within you knows the way. One afternoon, a young boy asked him, Master, how do we keep faith when the world grows dark? Elisha smiled softly. When the night deepens, he said, the stars shine brighter, and when faith is tested, love burns clearer. The boy looked at him with wonder. Then, Master, is love the fire? Elisha nodded. Yes, the truest fire is not in the sky, but in the heart that refuses to grow cold. The boy bowed and left, his steps lighter than when he came, and Elisha watched him go, knowing that the flame had passed again, quietly, invisibly, eternally. That night, the prophet sat beneath the stars. He thought of Elijah, of the mountain, of the chariot of fire. He thought of the countless souls he had comforted, the prayers whispered in broken homes, the water that healed the land. And he realized, the greatest miracle of all was not that fire once fell from heaven, but that heaven had learned to dwell in men. He closed his eyes. The wind brushed his face gently, like a familiar hand. He whispered, Lord, you are the same, yesterday, today, and forever. Your fire still burns, and I am content to rest in its warmth. The sky above shimmered faintly, and though no chariot came, a light seemed to surround him. It was not the fire of farewell. It was the fire of peace. His breath slowed, his heart stilled, and in that silence, the fire passed once more, from the old to the unseen, from the prophet to the promise. The next morning, villagers found him sitting beneath the olive tree, his face lifted toward heaven, a faint smile upon his lips. The cloak lay beside him, folded neatly, untouched by dust, and those who saw him said, he is gone to his rest. But the fire remains. Generations later, when children asked their elders about Elijah and Elisha, the stories were told not with fear, but with warmth. They no longer said, fire fell from heaven. They said, God still walks with us. The chariot of flame had become the lamp within every believing soul. And in that quiet, the eternal whisper continued to speak. The fire still burns. The dawn came with a stillness that felt eternal. For the first time in generations, the valley knew no war, and the fields whispered only peace. The people had built no temple, but their hearts had become sanctuaries. There were no trumpets, yet heaven seemed to listen. In the hush of that morning, the old scrolls were opened. The prophecies once sealed were read aloud. Words Elijah had spoken, and Elisha had carried in silence. Fire shall fall no more from the sky, it said, for the fire shall dwell within the hearts of men. Those who heard the words felt their spirits tremble. Some wept, others bowed their heads. They understood. The promise was never destruction. It was transformation. In that moment, the heavens were quiet, but every leaf shimmered like flame. The wind itself seemed to speak. This is the fulfillment, it whispered. Not in might, but in mercy. The people remembered Elijah's mountain, the roaring fire, the trembling earth, the still small voice that followed. They remembered Elisha's gentleness, his healing hands, his quiet prayers. Now they saw what the two prophets had carried across time, the revelation that God's true glory is not shown in wrath, but in love that endures through every generation. An old scribe lifted his head from the scroll and said, "Then the age of outward fire is ended." A child beside him replied, "No, it has only changed its dwelling." He pointed to his chest. "It burns here now." The elders smiled. The prophecy was fulfilled, not in spectacle, but in simplicity. For the first time, the people understood that every act of kindness, Every word of truth, every prayer whispered in the dark, was itself the continuation of Elijah's flame. That night, as the stars appeared, a light spread softly across the sky. Some said it was a comet. Others said it was the chariot returning. But those who knew the truth said, "It is the same fire, only gentler now." The heavens were not angry. They were open, and through that opening, peace descended like rain. The night deepened, and silence covered the earth like a prayer. The stars above the valley shimmered as if remembering something ancient. Then, in the stillness, a sound arose. Not thunder, not flame, but the whisper of remembrance. From horizon to horizon, a light formed slowly, like the first breath of creation. It was not fierce or consuming. It was warm, living, pure. And in that light, they saw him, not as a man of the past, but as the spirit of all who had walked with God. Elijah stood upon the air, his form radiant yet human, his eyes carrying both sorrow and joy. He spoke not with thunder, but with the tone of eternal love. "I was never gone," he said. "The fire you feared has been within you all along." He turned his gaze across generations. "I was in every act of courage, every prayer uttered in darkness, every hand that lifted another from despair." People fell to their knees, not from terror, but from peace. Heaven did not open with noise. It opened with understanding. Then a woman cried out, "Prophet of God, why have you come again?" Elijah smiled, to remind you that love was never lost. The light around him deepened, and the valley seemed to breathe with life. Rivers reflected the sky, and the stars trembled as if in song. He lifted his hand, and a flame appeared small as a candle, floating between heaven and earth. It did not burn, it shone like a living heart. "This," Elijah said, "is the fire that cannot die. It is the Spirit of the Lord, and it rests upon those who love." The people reached out, but the flame did not need to be touched. It entered them, not through their hands, but through their hearts. In that moment, they understood. Prophecy was not about knowing the future, but becoming part of it. Elijah continued, "When the world forgets, this fire will remind. When hearts grow cold, this fire will awaken. When nations fall into silence, this fire will speak again." His words flowed like the Jordan, soft yet unstoppable. Then his face became like the dawn, and his voice grew gentle. "Tell your children, the day of judgment is the day of love fulfilled. The chariot no longer carries fire to destroy, but light to restore." He raised his arms toward heaven, and a great wind began to move through the valley. It carried the scent of rain and new beginnings. "The covenant," he said, "is not written on stone anymore. It is written upon living hearts." A quiet awe spread among them. No one spoke. Every face was luminous. The flame that once fell from the sky now rested within them all. It flickered in the eyes of children, in the faith of mothers, in the wisdom of the old. And Elijah, the prophet who once called down fire, smiled as he watched the fire rise upward, not from the heavens, but from the earth. The valley rested in silence. The flame that had once burned upon the mountain now lived within countless hearts. No temple rose from the ground, yet every soul had become a sanctuary. Time passed, and generations walked the same earth. Wars began and ended, kingdoms rose and fell, but the quiet fire never died. It flickered in the voices of those who forgave, in the hands of those who healed, in the courage of those who loved truth more than life. And wherever the fire burned, darkness retreated. In distant lands, new prophets spoke, not in thunder, but in compassion. They told stories of a God who no longer dwelt in storms or temples, but in the hearts of those who walked humbly. Elijah's words had become eternal. The covenant is written not on stone, but on living hearts. As the centuries unfolded, the people forgot the prophet's face, but they never lost his message. His fire had no name anymore. It had become love itself. One night, a young woman knelt by her window. Her village was small and poor, and the stars were hidden behind clouds. She whispered, "Lord, are you still here?" And in the quiet of her heart, a warmth answered. It was not a voice, but it was enough. She smiled, and that smile was the continuation of the prophecy. The same fire that once fell upon Elijah now glowed in her prayer. Somewhere across the sea, a man in chains prayed for mercy, and his tears shone with the same light. In another land, a child shared his bread with a stranger, and the heavens rejoiced again. The fire had traveled farther than the chariot ever could. It had crossed ages, languages, and nations, until the whole world shimmered faintly with unseen light. The story of Elijah and Elisha became legend, and legends became scripture. But beneath all words, the truth endured, that the living God had chosen to dwell among his children, not above them. And so, in every age, when men called upon the Lord in despair, they did not need to look up to the sky. They only needed to look within. For there, beneath the dust and the longing, the fire still burned. The Spirit spoke softly. The miracle was never the chariot, but the journey of the heart. In that revelation, the heavens opened once more, not with noise, but with light. It spread over mountains, rivers, and cities, reaching every place where hope had flickered. It entered prisons, hospitals, battlefields, and homes. Wherever there was pain, the fire came as comfort. Wherever there was hatred, it came as mercy. Wherever there was death, it came as resurrection. The prophecy was fulfilled, not once, but forever. And as the final light rose, a voice neither young nor old spoke across the world. This is the fire of Emmanuel, God with us, not a distant flame, but a love that abides. The stars bowed, the winds hushed, and creation itself breathed peace. No one saw Elijah depart this time, for he had never truly left. His fire had found its home. And so it is written, the fire that began on the mountain has become the light of the world. The same Spirit that called Elijah now calls every heart by name. And to all who listen, the whisper remains, the fire still burns. If this story touched your heart, let the fire live on through you. Pray for those in need. Share light where there is darkness. And let your kindness become someone's answered prayer. If you felt the warmth of God's presence today, please press like, subscribe to join us on this journey of faith, and write Amen in the comments below, so that the flame of His love may continue to shine through all generations. Amen.